Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you today. It took me quite a lot of time to figure out what to present today. Let me try to explain to you why. My background is in environmental accounting for business. I did my PhD in accounting for biological customer services from a business perspective. And actually, I would have loved to give a presentation about the values of nature, valuation processes, and how it can change policies. Anyway, but the point is, I think I was tasked to think in terms of how national policies can influence local decision making and local, basically, people behavior. So I really went through all the projects that we did, and I thought to myself, I think that what could really work here is looking at a case study from a country called Uganda. I'll show you a map for those who may not know about where it is. And for the simple reason is that there is a link with rangelands. That was my only reason I chose that case study. So that was my link. Although the focus is not on rangeland per se, but the mining aspect are obviously changing people's lives. And their main livelihood is basically rangelands. Alright, so you just click, yeah. Okay, hopefully you can see that. That's East Africa, so it's a bit blurred. Uganda is a very small country, it's around here, just north. I won't touch it again. North of Lake Victoria. Kenya is just here. And basically it's a landlocked country. It's been under a lot of tension recently, there were lots of fighting, especially in the north. The region we're focusing on is just here, it's called Karamoja. We're frontier with Kenya and also South Sudan. So if you know a little bit about South Sudan recently, it's really tough. And why did we do this study? It was really a seed funding project from UK Aid, alright? Little money, we needed to do something very quick. And the idea was that we wanted to understand what is happening in terms of mining in the region. That was more or less the terms of reference. So, but IUCN and the guys who got the money for that asked us to do what they call a total economic valuation of basically the impact of mining and rangeland in the region. So we went there very naively. I went there with my, environmental accountant hat, and I wanted to calculate things. I wanted to get a net value of what's happening. And that's not really what we achieved to do for many different reasons. And I'm going to try to explain a little bit what we did. So these were really essentially the main aims of the study. It was quite quick and short, as I said, it was less than 6 months. It was about understanding what are the policy frameworks around mining, and there were two main sides of it, large-scale mining. So when most people think about mining, they think about big holes, coal or gold mining from Australia or South Africa. That's what we talk about in terms of large scale, lots of capital investment, lots of technology, and obviously high volumes output. But because we're in Uganda, like many of the regions in Africa, there's also what we call artisanal and small-scale mining. So what we're dealing with there is that communities working with very little tools on the ground, with their hands sometimes, and it's large-scale in the way that it involves thousands of people literally, but with little capital whatsoever, and so it's a completely opposite. So there was a policy environment around that. The goal was really to look about the short-term and long-term social, environmental and economic impact of those two types of activities in the region. And they wanted to get a net social benefit of mining. They wanted us to assess that. Well, sure, that was the original plan. And obviously the goal was potentially to discuss other alternative approaches. We didn't use the word pathways, obviously, but for sustainable mining in the region. So that's just very quickly the methodology. It's about scenario design, data collection and planning. It's about then modeling a little bit, and at the end of the day it was presenting the results to the different stakeholders. But I'm not going to go into details of that. I just want to talk a little bit about the legal and policy environment. There are 2 slides about that. It's actually quite old. It's from 2003, the mining legal environment. It deals with both large-scale and small-scale mining, and basically what they try to target is mostly around what they called financial benefit sharing of mining resources. How can you generate income for the national government, for local communities, and for everybody, right? And it talks about different types of rights. For instance, you've got exploration rights, you've got mineral lease, you've got different types, okay? And all of that is copied and pasted from other regions, basically, from South Africa or Australia. They're just copied and pasted, and they came up with a specific royalty setup. Let's I can't remember the exact number, but yeah, anyway. No, that's a distribution. 80% of the royalties will go to central government, and only 3% of royalties and taxes go to the owners of the land. That's the way it's written. But if you go to Karamoja, nobody owns land there. So that's a problem with that type of policy. So the entire piece of legislation is really focusing on attracting foreign investment. They want to see big mining happening in Uganda. They want to see a huge gold mine springing up from the ground. That's what the policymakers in Kampala were thinking of. That's why they designed that policy. So, as I said, yeah, basically the idea was the South African mines, and only very briefly they talk about compensation for loss of surface rights. Without explaining really what it is about, what do they mean by surface rights? It's basically the livelihoods of people. If you go there, you dig a hole, you might be destroying a river or a forest which is used by people for grazing or whatever. So they say that there should be compensation, but they don't explain how much and exactly how. It's very silent, right? So any company can apply for any right, wherever they want. They just need to be agreed upon by a couple of decision makers at the national level and the local level. And they buy the rights. It's very quick, easy, it's not very expensive. But the local customary rights are very loose, if I may say. Nobody has got land titles. Even customary land title doesn't exist. It's not like in China. There's no real help from the government. They don't help you. You just there, that's it. They don't. So that's a challenge. And all those mining rights, basically, as I said, they copy the English legal system, basically. They place it there without taking into account those surface rights, which are not defined, and people don't actually own them. It's more or less, it's, how can I say that? It's not tangible, it's much more based on social networks. You know you come from there, and you should be involved in the process, that's it. Sorry, it's not very easy to read, but basically what the government has been investing in is trying to map mineral resources in the region. So this is gold, this is, I think, that's limestone. Oh God, sorry, I'm not used to this thing. So there are many different resources, but what they're interested in is gold and platinum, okay? Because obviously they pump the money. But unfortunately, when we started the study, we found out, I was quite surprised, that there are the only proper mine actually being under exploitation is a marble mine. So that was quite a surprise for me. So they spend all this money on trying to map. It's not well done actually, and I mean you can show and you can know why, because it's not the role of the government to actually quantify all the reserves themselves. They usually rely on private sector involvement to get the exact numbers. But the point is they're trying to map that. But what they forget really about is that probably 40% of Karamoja is supposed to be protected areas. There's a national park around here, there are forest reserves around there, and the nice thing about that is that they've got national policies about conservation, biodiversity conservation, but those areas are open to mining as well. It's not forbidden. So we can see already a conflict there between people. And added to that, in half of the different types of protected areas, people live in them. So that's another complication. Just want to show you, that's the type of people you meet when you're in the capital. Thais, great. They're from different ministries, from NGOs and development aid. When you go into the ground, there's a lot of community members actually get paid to travel to the meeting, so you actually pay them, and that's another problem. They won't come if you don't pay them, so you wonder whether they're actually really telling you the truth at the end of the day. That's another story. But so that's the type of people you meet when you're in the towns. But when you go into the ground, in the bush basically, into the rangelands, that's the type of people that you meet. This is around the riverbed. It's just here. You've got a community of about 3,000 people living with no access to water, clean water, no electricity. Children digging gold into the sand of a river. That's their life. And the estimations vary between anything between 20 to 200,000 people in the region. Then you've got the mines. That's actually a real mine. It doesn't really look like a mine, but just behind that I'm going to show you another picture. There's a big marble area. That's the only tangible mining company that you can find with actual machinery. That's for marble. And these guys, it's just a little village that they set up next to the road. But every day, probably half of the community walks about maybe 5 to 20 k's into the bush, trying to get some stones in the ground. And they set up those little villages with pretty much nothing. They're just small mining towns. And these mining towns, they just move. They're not there forever. They've not been there before. So that's the context, okay? And people in Kampala don't really think about those guys, I'm telling you straight away. Okay, that's the picture I wanted to show you. That's the marble mine. If you can see, there's one little machine there, there's probably another there, but it's not the type of mining that you would find in South Africa. Very little capital investment, actually. That's the type of region. It was very green when I was there, but it's very dry. There's very little agriculture. I mean, maize doesn't grow there, not really. So the only thing that people do is basically livestock grazing. It's mostly, there's very little cattle, it's mostly goats. Okay? So everybody originally was a goat herder, moving along the landscape, with very clearly defined region where they could go, and then there was war, and then mining comes in on top of that. So that's the social context. Those are the case studies that we did. We went to see those companies. They were officially holding a mining license. The only ones we can come up with. One was dealing with, supposedly with marble mining. Another one, Dow Marble, that's one I just showed you, that was really marble. I'll explain to you why I say it was supposed to. I'll tell you a little bit after that. Jan Mangold, very interesting. It's basically Indians that were mining gold. Toro Cement, these guys here, they're supposed to mine limestone, but what we found out is that they're actually mining nothing. They're just buying stuff from local people who are digging stuff on the ground with shovels, with their hands. It's incredible. There's actually no mining, that's just a stock area. And then we tried to contact some artisanal, some small-scale mining communities, and it was quite challenging because, as I said, you can't actually see them. There are no roads. I mean, they're in the bush. And the funny thing about those guys is that you can see buyers on the road coming in cars and then walking, and they actually buy gold in their pockets, and they walk around the countryside like that. And they then sell it to Kampala, and then it goes wherever. So there's a huge black market around that. And that's, I want to tell you a little bit more about that right now, is that the government policy was obviously to get royalty money for development, right? But it's really failing to see that a lot of the mining is like that, sold to informal dealers, which don't pay any tax whatsoever. Alright, I'm just going to show you those examples into a bit more details. Our goal was really to find what data is available, what kind of information we can get, and try to do some modeling, right? That was the goal. And for the only place where we can find any data whatsoever was for the marble mine. And the reason for that is that if you know marble, it's very heavy. You can't carry it around in your pocket, so you need a minimum of machinery. These guys were from Egypt, and they were actually quite a good company. They wanted to do well, right? They were embedded into the social setting. They tried to do things in a proper manner, so they had an environmental impact assessment, the only company with one. It's by law you need to do one, but the others didn't have any. So they did an environmental impact assessment, but the problem with that impact assessment is that it was pretty empty. No quantification of impact, very little explanation of what's going to happen. But yes, it did talk about the main issues. I'm not going to go into the detail of that because it's just going to take too much time. But the point is, 90% of the land in the mining lease is customary law. There's a little bit of private land because it's close to town. A very high level of short nomadic transhumance due to the lack of pasture and water for animals. So basically, people move around the landscape quite a lot. Very low surface water, so that's a real challenge and a limitation for livelihoods. And obviously, keeping livestock is a main thing. But within the mining license, you've got people mining illegally. So you've got thousands of people digging marble with small pieces. Alright, within the license. So we did a very high-level impact assessment. We're trying to quantify qualitatively what type of impacts would be happening. And the main ones were basically habitat transformation and visual impact. I mean, if you just go there now, you can see that the mountain is being cut in half. That's basically what is happening close to town. So that has a cost, I mean, in terms of potential tourism development, for instance. Sorry, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the only thing I want to show you is really that table. We try to capture what is this company giving to the country, right? So right now they say that they spend about $2,600,000 in terms of capital investment, right? The government is betting on having approximately 41 million of US dollars of royalties over the next 20 years. That's what they're hoping for, they're praying for, right? So that means there's going to be about an extra, I think, yeah, it's 10 million US dollars of operation cost over that period. And when you think about it, that's very small scale. That's very little money for a mine. And the big problem is that you only got 30 people employed by the mine. 30. When you've got thousands of illegal miners around it. You've got 20 Egyptians. Because, okay, they can't accept women on the working side because it's not Muslim compatible. That's another issue. And only 10 Ugandans. And those guys are basically the cleaning guys. So for me that was quite striking. There was very little certainty in terms of the royalties, very little investment really, no capacity building locally, and these guys were pretty actually good. They're trying to do good. Seriously, they're not bad. I'm going to talk about the bad guys after that. And really, also the thing which is more worrying is that they're actually buying from the local guys as well, on the side. But who is keeping track of that? I don't know. So they're spending a little bit. So they're spending money on buying other marble from local communities, and that relationship is not very clear. And that's very frightening when you think about it, because they only take responsibility for 30 people. The other guys are just, yeah, they're in nature basically. Then we did a very simple modeling of basically the induced and indirect impact on the economy of that, based on very limited statistics that were available. And when you look at it, if you got, we use conservative values in terms of indirect impact and a bit more positive values. Just to explain to you, if you invest $1 US of money, you can assume that there's going to be indirect impact to the economy by a factor of, I don't know, 1 to 3, for instance, depending on your sector, depending on your activity. And the problem with that, you need to rely on strong national statistics to be able to model that. There's no national statistic in Uganda. So you can just assume, based on what's happening in other countries, that it can vary from 1 to 3 or whatever. So when you look at that, the most that this product is going to bring is 75 jobs. And really, we really failed to actually assess what we wanted to do, which was the net social impact of the mine. We wanted to get all the internal costs, social and environmental costs, all the environmental and social benefits. We wanted to quantify all of that, but it's really impossible because for very pragmatic reasons, the policy level and the context doesn't help with that. The government doesn't provide support for the local people to get data, to monitor anything. It's Africa, I guess, you can say that. And because of that, it's very difficult to provide a full accounting picture of that. So I'm not going to go into the detail of that, but if you want to ask questions or you calculate all those things, I'm more than happy to oblige. What I'm going to spend time on are the other mines. And this is for me really terrible. That's a model which is being basically promoted, not officially, but in real life. For all the other mines, I'm talking about gold mining, limestone mining, and that one is also actually marble mining, African minerals. You buy cheap mineral rights, very cheap. All the work is done by local people with their hands, mostly. No capital investment. They go into area and they plan to go out after 5 years, especially if you think about the mining. Sorry, there's no picture of that, but the mine is just below. They basically mine in the riverbed, right? So they do maybe, it's a better picture maybe. So people are doing that on their site, and they use a little bit of machinery to dig, to make it a bit quicker, but that's very limited. And that specific site, you can see the infrastructure. Look at the roof. They're not investing, these guys. They're just there to make quick money and easy money. In 5 years, they're gone. And it's actually quite scary, because the landscape is becoming this. So for livestock grazing, you can just forget about it as well. And the problem with gold mining is that you get a little bit of it, but you need a large surface area. So the entire riverbed is going to be like this. And that's for gold also for marble and limestone, because limestone, the way they do it there, they don't dig in depth, they don't have the machinery to do that. It's all surface. So the funny thing about the place is that when you walk into a bush, there's a 50% chance that you break a leg. Because there are holes from anything to 1 meter to 4 meters deep that were dug by people, but nobody took the time to fill them back. So it's very dangerous. You can't believe how many people get get killed because so that's the context. And the worst of it, that's for me the worst, is that mining actually is a social thing in Karamoja. It's done by thousands and thousands of people that are nomadic, that come from different regions, that stay there for a little time, and these guys, they only have got sales data, they know how much they make, right? And the funny thing about that is that they're not income poor. They make actually quite a lot of money very quickly. The problem is, what do they do with the money? Because those villagers that you see there have been there for maybe 5 years, and it's probably going to stop in maybe 2 years because there's no more gold in that area, there is no investment in anything which is of a public nature. In schools, in water, in health and sanitation, there's no investment. Because that village is going to be dead in 5 years, I'm not joking. Nobody's going to live there, there's no agriculture possible, and the landscape is going to be dead because it's going to be mined out. So, basically the national policy completely fails to recognize that, doesn't even care, they're just trying to get easy money by big mining. The problem with that is that no company actually wants to do big mining in the region. They're using those resources, cheap labor, to do the work. So for me, it's a very interesting case of our national policy doesn't really speak to what's happening on the ground at all. And when we did that study, it was, as I said, it was still funding, it was only $30,000 and a very small budget. We did that very quickly. We wanted to get an appreciation of the net benefits and cost. But I think it's a mess. And the problem with that is that it's applicable to probably at least 10 to 15 African nations. At least. If you go to Gabon, if you go to DRC, it's even worse. Right. So yeah, we did a lot of recommendations on best practices, what could be done or not. I just want to mention a few of them. I'm not involved in corporate accountability work, and there's also a policy on corporate social investment in Uganda. We make the strong point that it's not about giving money to schools or churches. It's about accountability. It's about disclosing how much money you're making, how much money you're spending on people, on health and safety and all of that. So that's a critical thing. And that's why I think valuation or information or accounting are critical tools for decision making and discussion. And the key thing in Uganda is that there is opacity about information. Information is held in the hands of a few people. I don't know about China, but it's very difficult to get information. To get an EIA, which is supposed to be a public document, you can't believe how much time it took us. And it was given to us, I wouldn't say illegally, but not through the official channel. So, really, data for me is a critical thing. People are not aware of what's happening at any scale. They don't know where the key resources are, I mean the local people. They don't know if a mining company has actually bought a mining right on their land. They don't know. And if they do, sometimes it's just the main guys who get compensation, obviously. I mean, I could talk about that if it was the case, but so it's really a mess. And the other things I wanted to mention is that I was very keen to talk about all the best practices in terms of child labor, mine rehabilitation, biodiversity management. I mean, there's a lot that you can draw from Australia or South Africa, but the situation is so bad that it's not even relevant. There's no system of accountability at all in the government, and that's unfortunately the situation. So, thinking about the pathways approach a little bit, I did that very quickly because first time I hear about it in a formal presentation. There's obviously a national doctrine about how mining should happen in this country. It's very clear. It's supposed to be foreign investment based. It's supposed to be based on machinery and capital investment, and it's really failing. I mean, it's not happening for different reasons. And what we're seeing is really a black market, which is huge. It's involving a big chunk of the population. and it's creating a lot of social tensions because you got foreigners coming in and they're not accepted as well. And I don't know if you're familiar with Uganda, but not so long ago it was a community-based system with communities around a specific region working and living together. And because of mining, it's bringing a lot of problems such as prostitution, something new for a lot of those communities, and obviously HIV/AIDS is going up. So, what would be the alternatives? I think it would be interesting to think about what does it mean to actually integrate artisanal and small-scale mining into the economy. The government has got just a policy to say you can register yourself as a community-based mining association if you want. It's not very expensive, it's just that much. Just think about it. Artisanal mining is a nomadic exercise, it's just like racing. You stay there for 2 years and then you move. What would be the point to ask for a mining license, which is going to cost you a lot of money, and you're not even sure you're going to find gold the next day? Because you don't have any technology, I mean, you're just digging, eh? So the policy is completely flawed. So yeah, that's more or less what I just want to say. It's really, I think, we shouldn't call it small and artisanal mining, we should call it nomadic mining. That's my point also. It's nomadic, and I heard a lot of discussion about there's no more nomadic lifestyles in the world, it's becoming more and more sedentary. And I think actually it's not so true in many contexts. I don't know about China and rural China, but in Africa, mining is becoming nomadic at a big scale. And it's involving millions and millions of people. Okay, thanks.